Can we do it for the pod? Do it for the pod.
Oh yeah. Welcome to another week of what is turning out to be a pretty entertaining summer in the smartphone industry in Canada. This is SyrupCast, and last week Rogers bore the brunt of the blame in what the CRTC calls unjust discrimination against new entrants in regards to domestic roaming. The issue at hand is exclusivity. Rogers is accused of forcing new entrants like Wind, MobileSyrup, Eastlink, and others to sign exclusivity agreements for domestic roaming, preventing them from negotiating with other service providers and thus keeping prices high. While the CRTC has not yet made a decision on whether it will regulate the price of domestic roaming outside of preventing incumbents from charging new entrants more than their existing customers, the move bodes well for companies looking to expand service at reasonable cost. We'll delve deep into these issues and more in Week 7 of the SyrupCast, and Doug will regale us with his opinion of Guardians of the Galaxy, because he originally asked me to go with him and then dumped me to take a girl instead. And no, I'm not bitter. This is SyrupCast's Domestic Roaming Appaloosa. Let's go. Doug, how are you, sir?
Do it for the pod. The best part about that was that the Guardians of the Galaxy thing was actually written into the intro. That was not an ad-lib. And yes, I did choose a lovely lady from Tinder to take to a Sunday matinee of Guardians of the Galaxy. So there's a lot of levels to that. Yeah, Rogers is not doing it for the pod. And as I look at our list of news to talk about this week, I just got so angry and sad that, you know, it has been an exciting summer, but we're a little bit in the, I don't know if it's the dog days, but good. Oh, I just want to
strangle a carrier.
Yeah.
Okay, don't strangle a carrier, but let's talk instead about how Rogers has been strangling other carriers. So basically, on July 31st, Rogers was accused by the CRTC, not accused, the CRTC found Rogers engaged in unjust discrimination. Now, there's a difference there, because an accusation is something that is not yet proven, or it's not yet backed up in fact, but they found through a bunch of a bunch of research and complaints by the new entrants that this unjust discrimination and undue preference was keeping prices high. So
yeah. If the roaming don't fit, you must acquit. But the roaming fit.
The roaming fit really well for Rogers. Now, okay, so there's a lot of angles here. Basically, at the time that these exclusivity agreements were signed, Rogers was the only GSM carrier capable of providing domestic roaming service. Now, let's give a little bit of background as to what domestic roaming is. So, when you're on Wind or MobileSyrup or Eastlink or Videotron, these companies don't really provide national service. So when you go out of an area that they provide service in, it's called their away network, and they roam on another carrier inside Canada. So that's called domestic roaming, which contrasts with international roaming, which is where you're on Rogers and then you go to Buffalo to buy a really expensive purse, and you roam on like AT&T or T-Mobile. So that's a difference. And what the CRTC found was that Rogers, in order to give these companies some, I guess, a break in pricing, said that you can't negotiate with any other businesses. So once Bell and Telus launched their HSBA Plus networks in 2010, these carriers couldn't then go to one of them and say, okay, Rogers is giving us X dollars per megabyte, can you give us any better? So that's kind of why it wasn't possible to roam on 3G in any other parts of the country when you're on Wind or MobileSyrup, because Rogers just wasn't giving them a good deal, and they weren't allowed to negotiate with Bell or Telus to do the same. Now, I'm pretty sure that's called anti-competitive practices, but what do you...
Yeah, so there's that, though, but then there's also, I think, part of the ruling as well was that Rogers is not going to be allowed to charge more than they would charge. They're not going to be allowed to charge a carrier more than they would charge a customer for this, right?
But that's not
So,
just Rogers. That was a decision that was passed by the CRTC earlier. Well, it wasn't passed by the CRTC. It was basically amended into the Telecommunications Act, which is a stopgap to the CRTC regulating the exact same thing. It's a kind of a weird cockamamie scheme that they have going on. But the government works with the CRTC and vice versa to pass law and to enact regulation. And I guess right now it's cheaper for these carriers to negotiate with any of the for these carriers to negotiate with any of the incumbents because they're not allowed to charge them any more than they would charge their customer for domestic roaming. Does that make sense?
none of this makes sense. So, because I think as you correctly pointed out here, that shout out to the CRTC for continuing to be diligent with things like this. As Ontarians, this isn't necessarily something that we deal with on the regular, but it affects quite a few people, and I think we're going to get to the Bell news later about how just egregious and disappointing local roaming can be. But I think that one of the things that you highlighted in your original piece was that the outcome of this decision is a little up in the air because there's concern that now this will allow carriers like Bell, Rogers, and Telus to get really discounted roaming in areas where they're actually not available.
Yeah.
Which might impede their plans to really fully cover a province beyond the 2 or 3 cities necessary to get 80% of penetration. So you would actually have, as in the case with Manitoba, people paying domestic roaming for just living not in Winnipeg.
well, yeah. So that's exactly what has been going on for Telus and Bell. So Bell and Telus have a joint network, and that's something that we need to remember, is that Bell and Telus share their infrastructure. They share their spectrum. They share their towers. Bell generally builds on the east, and Telus generally builds in the west. And in Ontario, they come together and they build together, and then they share. Now, that's not a fact. That Telus does build in the Maritimes, and Bell obviously has their own towers in British Columbia and Alberta. But for the most part, Telus has a wider service offering. But what's happening here is that Bell and Telus now have the opportunity to negotiate with companies like Eastlink and Mobilicity and Wind and T-Baytel and all these companies, these regional carriers or these new entrants that before just were not getting a good, a shake. Mm-hmm. They weren't able to competitively offer data services, especially data services, outside of their own home areas. So still today, Wind doesn't offer 3G service outside of their home area. They still offer only Edge, which is 2G, in places that they can't provide their own towers.
Yeah, and I think there was something
slow.
Yeah, you didn't mention before, is that it's not only just the pricing competition. It's if the exclusivity deal would lock carriers into certain levels of data bandwidth technology because they wouldn't be able to go outside that and provide anything more, right? So you have a situation with Wind where they're just, what's one of the main complaints about Wind's service is you get outside of the core and you're stuck with data rates that are not applicable to, or data speeds that are not applicable to 2014, right?
Right. It's ridiculous. I mean, on one hand, Wind has been really aggressively rolling out dual carrier or dual cell HSPA plus service in their home network areas. So in places like Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, and Vancouver and Victoria, they have much faster speeds, double the speeds that they did this time last year. Mm-hmm. But they don't have LTE yet, and we'll get to that later. But what they do have is they have really good speeds inside their service areas, and then the second you leave, the second you go to Oakville or the edge of Pickering or up north when you hit Major Mac, and I'm talking about Toronto here because I'm not familiar with the localities of other cities because I'm a Toronto boy.
So think generally 45 minutes outside of the downtown Toronto core.
Yeah, more or less. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's too bad because you can make phone calls and you can send texts, but the second you want to look up a website or even listen to a song, the bandwidth just isn't there anymore because Rogers is only offering them 2G service.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, it's been good for Wind because they've been able to say we have a national network. If you need to make a phone call while you're in the middle of the Trans-Canada Highway on your way to Winnipeg, you can do so because Rogers offers that service.
Yes, but it's there for the brand. But if the customers at the end of the day don't believe it, and they know that Wind only really works when you're downtown, I'm sure it's been impeding churn to Wind.
Oh, it's been the major reason why Wind doesn't have more customers. I mean, people don't generally stay in their own service area, and I mean there are other technical issues that have prevented Wind from growing as quickly as they would want to. For example, limiting them to AWS spectrum means that they don't really have the penetration inside buildings that Rogers and Bell have, Rogers, Telus, and Bell. But on the domestic roaming side, now Wind will offer unlimited 3G domestic roaming by the end of the year. That's something that Tony Lacavera, the chairman of Global Live and one of the kind of heads of Wind Mobile Canada, promised me. He said that even if domestic roaming isn't regulated by the end of this year, and it probably won't be, it'll probably take until next March, next April after the 2 spectrum auctions, even if it doesn't actually take, it will still be cheaper because of all this preemptive stuff. Rogers and Bell and Telus are getting ahead of the regulation by offering better pricing. So we've seen this from MTS and Rogers offering Bell better service in Manitoba, and we'll get to that in a second. But one of the more interesting ones is Eastlink, and Eastlink is a new entrant that launched in 2013, and they're owned by the Bragg family, so they're a private company. They don't really offer anything other than kind of technology services. So they have a home phone, they have internet, and now they have an LTE network. But they were roaming on Rogers, it seemed, and now they have a unique network partner, which means that they've probably supplemented Rogers' coverage with Bell and Telus in the area to fill in the gaps where their previous domestic roaming couldn't reach. So now they're basically blanketing the entire Maritimes at super cheap rates, and they are able to do it without revealing who their domestic partner is for strategy reasons. But this is a really big deal.
Yeah, if you live on the East Coast, it's going to be huge, right? And it's amazing that it's taking till now for them to be able to use their phone wherever. And if we want to jump to the Bell news, by contrast in Manitoba, just the news that Bell kind of trying to get ahead of the game here is that they're going to stop charging their customers domestic roaming within the province, which is great for their customers because their service is relatively limited in Manitoba to the PEG. Shout out to the PEG, and then surrounding regions. It's insane that they were charging their customers anyways to have to use cellular service in their province. Like this is a case where instead of increasing their coverage, Bell was charging their customers to roam in places where they were unwilling to provide service. So you have these, I guess, two contrasting acts, and I'm wondering if all of this is tied together. If this really relates to, and we talked about this last week a bit, the hearing that's going to be happening in September on the competitive state of the wireless market. If the carriers are trying to get certain ducks in a row to make a better case that either competition is either there or that there's less impediments upon service and pricing for customers. Like, do you feel that this is potentially PR related with the Bell thing, or like, how do you feel that the big three carriers are approaching this upcoming public hearing?
I think you're absolutely right. So what's interesting to me is that Bell doesn't really have a presence in Manitoba. So I spoke to Ben Class, and he's very he lives in like rural Manitoba, and he's the guy who gained fame for filing a complaint against Bell for their anti-net neutrality policies by allowing their own customers to not have their Bell TV bandwidth count against their monthly data allotment. So there's currently a complaint going through the CRTC in regards to that, and he told me that Bell doesn't really have a huge presence there. He said there's about 1 million customers overall in Manitoba, and 1 million wireless customers in Manitoba. So I don't think Bell really has a lot of market share to make up, but what they do want to do is they want to make sure that a customer who moves to Manitoba is not basically out of luck when they roam anywhere outside of the greater Winnipeg area. And Rogers and MTS is a regional carrier like SaskTel that has a pretty big presence, and they built up their own network to some extent, and then they partnered with Rogers to fill in the gap. So Rogers and MTS have a joint partnership for both HSPA Plus and LTE connectivity in areas that Bell and Telus just cannot and don't care to reach. I mean, we're talking like super rural Manitoba where the population density is just ridiculously low.
Yeah, but that's the point right there, where there could be coverage, but Bell doesn't care to reach. So
they don't have they don't have the spectrum. It's important that they don't. It's not so much that they don't care to reach it. It's that they don't own the spectrum necessary to roll out a wide LTE network in those areas. So it's not. I don't know if it's necessarily. I mean, it's probably both. I think that if they had wanted to bid on the spectrum in the first place, they could have, but they didn't. But on the other hand, it's not the return on investment would be too low. So going this route, especially when you mentioned that exact thing, that they're putting their ducks in a row, they're offering. Rogers is going to say, "Oh, we gave Bell a really great deal on domestic roaming. I mean, look at us, we're benevolent." And Bell's going to say, "Hey, now we worked with one of our major competitors because we compete with them all the time. Compete. And just a side note, Bell and Telus. Today's August 7th. Bell and Telus put out their Q2 earnings results today, and peppered throughout their earnings results were competitive market, lower results based on competitive market, higher prices, 2-year contracts, lower. It's just like. It seems like they're saying it's a hugely competitive market, but because we were able to charge more money, and this goes back to our argument last week, we were actually able to earn more money. So both of them earned higher profit and higher revenue from their mobile divisions, but they both complained that the domestic market was so competitive that they couldn't earn more money.
Yeah, it impeded them. Yeah, so. Just going back to this, Bell is definitely going to spin this agreement, and I understand them not wanting to put towers there. The problem is that they were passing off a cost of their, a strategic disinterest to them onto the customer. This was something that if you were a Bell customer in Manitoba, you had to pay to use Bell service across Manitoba. And that's something that you might understand if you, say, are an Eastlink customer on the East Coast, or you're using one of the regional carriers and you signed up with a smaller service that is local to you, and maybe you're traveling around and you realize that there's going to be roaming there. But when you're with a national carrier and they're charging you while you're in your province for data access, I think that's insane. And I also think what you mentioned in the releases today, where they're saying the market is so competitive that we're seeing these results that are somehow allowing us to be more profitable than ever, but impeding our profits. So we're happy with where we are, but we're not too happy. I'm wondering what position this puts the CRTC in. So we talked last week about, was it last week or maybe the week before, about the upcoming spectrum auctions and the ability to what regional carriers will be allowed at like a right of first refusal to expand their services. Mm-hmm. And we have this upcoming public hearing in September following the CRTC's latest announcement that they found that Roger was doing anti-competitive practices. In both instances, we're seeing the CRTC being fairly aggressive in terms of trying to maintain some sort of order or break through the kind of hegemony, but concerns that there might be unintended consequences to their actions, or maybe they're not going far enough. So I'm wondering, we know how the carriers are approaching this. This is something that we've kind of been tracking for a few podcasts now. How do you feel that either the CRTC or the companies like Wind and Videotron are going to be approaching the September hearings in terms of what they want to get out of it and how they are publicly going to present? Because I remember, I think our second podcast when we had Ian on, I asked you guys, what Wind would be saying a year from now, and you both kind of deferred. But it seems as though things have kind of narrowed in now, that there's a legitimate goal in September to try and come out with, even if it's just a change in positioning, to kind of restructure how the CRTC focuses its next 6 months. Because if the big three can present that there really is competition in the state of the wireless market in Canada, which is just insane, the CRTC might have a weaker mandate to kind of push forward for a fourth national carrier, or to be less aggressive in these findings and controlling. And I would be very concerned by that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that in this report, in the decision regarding wholesale domestic roaming, what the CRTC is not a partisan body. I mean, they're not supposed to be pushing for a certain agenda, but they are supposed to be falling in line with government policy. So the current government policy, as stated over and over by James Moore, Industry Minister, is that they want to make it they want to make the market more conducive to a fourth carrier across the country in every region. Mm-hmm. So there's actually a section here called consistency with the policy direction, and the policy direction is capitalized, and we talk about how the Commission considers the prohibitive exclusive roaming wholesale agreements is efficient and proportionate to its purpose, and interferes with the operation of market forces to the minimum extent necessary to meet the policy objectives stated above. And the policy objectives are CRTC's policy objectives, but what they're trying to do is they're working with the Telecommunications Act, which is clear in its interest to push the ongoing kind of competition in Canada. So what I find so interesting is that this decision was meant to make it as non-disruptive as possible in the Canadian wireless market, while ensuring that competition is more or less increased. So that's why they didn't make any wider claims. With this decision, the claims were not that Rogers was engaging in undue discrimination or unjust practices for every part of its wireless domestic roaming policies, or that its prices were too high, but that the exclusivity itself was at fault here. And that's really all they can do, because as you said, if Rogers, if the CRTC starts regulating domestic roaming rates, this could actually advantage Rogers, Bell, and Telus in areas where they don't have service. And that's a big problem, because then SaskTel and MTS and all these other carriers, and even Videotron would be able to, if there are areas of the country where Rogers, Telus, and Bell don't cover, they could just go up to these new entrants and say, hey, we want you to lend us service from your tower, and by the way, you can't charge us more than X dollars per megabyte or X cents per megabyte.
It could really garrot the regional carriers, and that's concern. And then maybe Bell for now is not pushing the cost off to their customers, but that could change. So I completely agree that you're right that the CRTC has taken like the most Canadian of approaches, very measured, very focused, not kind of blanket statements. They're slowly trying to prod this situation with a stick towards their intended goals. I guess the question that I'm trying to get to is this? Do you think that this is going to have an impact? What do we expect from a September hearing, and what do we expect the carriers to do in the month leading up to that to make their case? Because as I look at the numbers, I know we want to talk about Videotron's LTE launch, but we're also looking at they're now at 550,000. And recently, I think actually just yesterday, we talked about Wind now having just under 750,000. So we're looking at, we've talked about possible mergers before, at 1.3 million subs. Still,
yeah, they'd still be tiny.
Tiny in comparison to even what third place would be, I guess, probably Bell at just under 8 million.
Right. So, okay, so let's go back to what we were talking about. Videotron obtained some really important 700 megahertz spectrum in the auction earlier this year, but they're not going to do anything with it until the CRTC regulates domestic roaming rates. Mm-hmm. And they say that even if the limitation is for carriers to charge the other carriers, less than or the same as what they charge their customers for domestic roaming, that's still too much. They want wholesale rates the same way that TechSavvy and Akinak and all these companies have today in the DSL and cable internet space. And I don't think that until those changes have actually come into effect, Videotron's going to do anything with their national network. So they're launching an LTE network in Quebec where they have 700 megahertz spectrum, because that's what they did as well. In addition to buying spectrum in Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta, they purchased the same block in Quebec. So they're using that to launch an LTE network, which is fantastic for their 550,000 customers. But Wind is also at that same point where they can't really grow unless they get more spectrum. So it's a chicken or egg scenario, because Videotron has to make a decision about what they want to do with Wind or Mobilicity before they can bid on the set-aside spectrum that the government has set aside for new entrants in the AWS-3 auction. Now, the AWS-3 auction is really interesting because it's pretty much the same type of spectrum as what was auctioned in 2008. It's the same kind of spectrum that Wind and Mobilicity and Videotron run on today. And it's the same spectrum that Rogers, Bell, and Telus launched their LTE networks on. So at the same time as Wind and Mobilicity launched their HSPA Plus networks, the incumbents use that same spectrum to launch LTE. So there's great potential here for interoperability. We just don't know how the band plans are going to play out. And now that's pretty technical, but what it means is that if there's an agreement as to how the AWS-3 spectrum can be incorporated into current devices, there's a chance that it would work with with devices that currently run on AWS. So we're talking about for LTE and for HSPA Plus. Without getting too technical,
just do it. No one listening to this podcast is expecting anything less than the most technical. And if you came to this podcast wanting like the latest leaks of device screenshots, you came to the wrong podcast. So let's give them the real deal.
Okay, so the way it works is that Band 4 is considered AWS 1, and it takes a swath of spectrum in both the 1700 and 2100 megahertz range. Now, it's the lower range of each one, and what it does is it uses one for outgoing transmissions and one for incoming transmissions, and that way they don't get in each other's way, and it's pretty efficient. And this is an established band plan that is the same across the U.S. and Canada. So as far as I know, no other countries use AWS for HSPA or LTE. But T-Mobile uses it for HSPA. They used it for HSPA Plus, and they still do in some areas. They're currently using it for LTE in many areas, and both AT&T and Verizon use AWS for their LTE networks in certain parts of the U.S. So interoperability is definitely possible with existing handsets. The only thing that they haven't decided is how they're going to bring AWS 3, which is, as I said, part of 1700 and 2100, but it's a different block of spectrum in that same region, because obviously you have 100 megahertz between 1700 and 1800, and 100 megahertz between 2100 and 2200. We don't know how that's going to be combined into one, if it's going to be a separate band, or whether they're going to take that spectrum and just combine it into this overarching band 4 or whatever band number that they choose, and they're going to call it just AWS like they currently do. We don't know, because the U.S. hasn't auctioned off AWS 3 either. So Canada's going to be auctioning off AWS 3 around the same time as the U.S., and this is the first time that that's ever happened, because AWS was auctioned in the U.S. before the Canadians did it, and 700 megahertz was auctioned way before the Canadians did it. So when Canada had to adopt that same band plan, they just said, okay, well, the U.S. is going to do it one way, we're just going to copy them. And they did for the most part.
And as we said before, maybe copying the U.S. is not the best way to go. So if you kind of blacked out there for a moment while Daniel was talking, I think there's two strong takeaways. First being, the next time you complain about a dropped call, just reconsider the magic, like the Doctor Who level magic that is required for any sort of data to fly through the air to your phone at all times. Second, all the cards are there for this to play out the way that the Canadian government and Canadian consumers, in the interest of competition, want. It's a matter of in what order the cards play for this to happen. And I want to go back to something you said in terms of Videotron's hopes, because this is also another story that's kind of happening at the U.S. level in a different way, where Videotron's essentially hoping that cellular data and telephony is treated as a utility in the same way that I guess we want to say hardlined internet is. They want to essentially pay the flat bulk fee for the data pipes. Are you confident? Do you think that that's going to happen? Is it even possible to speculate on that? Is that the first card that needs to fall for this to follow? And do you see it coming?
Yeah, okay, so I think that the Canadian government knows that there are only a few possible players here. So Wind's parent company, VimpelCom, doesn't really want to invest more in Canada because they can't take full ownership over Wind Mobile. As per the Canadian government, for security reasons, the bid for majority ownership was denied. So even though the government said, and they changed their policy a couple of years ago to say that foreign ownership rules for carriers under 10% national market share were lifted, meaning that theoretically a company like VimpelCom could take ownership over Wind Mobile, or that was the reason that all the companies freaked out last summer over Verizon entering Canada. That wasn't allowed on security grounds. So they said one thing and then they did something else, and it was a big mess up because they also denied the Naquib Sawiris' company, who he used to own Wind Mobile, and then he sold it over to VimpelCom. He made a bid, or his I guess holdings company made a bid to purchase Allstream from MTS last year, and that was also denied by the government on security grounds. So what the hell? We don't know what's going to happen. So the thing is, the government says one thing and then it does another. We don't know whether it's going to be consistent in its rulings.
Well, I think it's more that the government says a lot of things, and that those policies, individual policies, can conflict in a way that, you know, in the short term they all make sense, but for specific cases it creates points of tension for certain things to happen. But sorry, continue.
No, 100%, and you're absolutely right. But my major issue with this is that Videotron is waiting for the government or for the CRTC to regulate domestic roaming rates until they do something. The problem is what comes first, because Videotron's not going to make a move until that regulation happens. But it seems like the regulation is going to happen after, if it happens at all, it'll happen after the AWS-3 auction. So we have a situation where they've set aside 30 megahertz of spectrum for new entrants, and those new entrants may not bid on it at all because they're prevented from bidding on it outside of areas where they currently have service, but they also have less than 10% market share nationally. So it's like there are basically two players. There's Wind and Videotron that can bid on this, or Wind and Quebecor, and Quebecor doesn't, or Videotron doesn't operate anywhere outside of Quebec, and Wind has no capital. They have no money. So we've posted a couple of times that Wind is actually looking to take on outside investment from a US-based holdings company, and I hope they do because they need that money for the spectrum auction. But they could have been just as well served by investing in the 700 megahertz spectrum auction, and they didn't. So who knows what's going to happen?
Well, and again, that potential influx of cash would also be dependent upon an understanding of the return from that, which would be like the money's got to be spent on something, and no one's going to invest unless they know that the cards will fall in place. So, and I think this is something we've been tracking with the CRTC, is where I feel they are taking a measured and moderate approach, but it almost seems like if they just sat down and mandated how this was really going to play out, it would be simpler for everyone else. I'm really concerned that the agreement that Bell is signing in Manitoba will be enough to delay what Videotron is looking for, simply because no one's waiting. I guess the best corollary I have, which is really dumb, and if no one follows sports, this isn't going to make any sense, but in the NBA free agency, we just recently had LeBron James, the best player in the world, decide to switch teams. And every other team needed to sign major free agents. There was tons out there. No other team was willing to make a move until the first card of LeBron James fell, and then everyone else was snapped up. I feel like this is a similar situation where we might just see the whole thing fall flat on its face and no changes in developments, simply because the big three carriers have enough to kind of defer significant decisions, which closes the window of opportunity for a company like Videotron. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's worst case scenario for Canadians looking for both the Canadian government and Canadians looking for a fourth national carrier. But,
all right, so let me play devil's advocate for a moment here.
Okay.
Yes, prices are high. They're higher than they were 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They're actually quite obnoxious, I agree. But here's the thing. Even if there's no new entrant or there's no major company that takes over as the national fourth carrier, even if Wind Mobile continues as they are, the networks themselves are not going to get any worse. I mean, we have some of the best networks in the world, and I'm sorry if somebody decides to say to me, "Oh yeah, but we pay more than any other country to get those networks." That's fine, but I mean, other than Russia, we are the biggest country with the smallest population density, except for these major urban areas where we do have a fourth carrier in every single region. So we can't really say that there's no competition. It's just that there's not the kind of competition that we want. It's not the same competition that we find in Europe. So or as you and I have talked about before, there is no T-Mobile equivalent here. We don't have that. What's the CEO's name? T-Mobile CEO.
Jesus. Laguerre. John
Yes,
Laguerre.
we don't have a John Laguerre to like big us up and tell all the other carriers off because we're Canada and we're far too polite. And even if we had a competitive fourth national carrier, he would still be more like Anthony Lacavera. He would take a very pointed and conservative approach when he speaks in public because that's just kind of the way that our businesses are. You know,
That's just how we do. Shout out Canada. Okay,
right,
I get that. I think you have to split two things because you're totally right, and then we should maybe jump off this, and I want to talk a little bit about the devices you are using. We are going to do some sexy device stuff, but there are two things here. I don't believe there's the competition argument and there's the fourth national carrier. A lot of this conversation is based upon the presumption that actually having a fourth national carrier will create a competitive environment for these companies, where in having such a smaller subscriber base, a Wind, Videotron, or whomever amalgam will really look to be aggressive in growing their subscriber numbers. Like that's the assumption. Might not happen. A year from now, we could see a fourth national carrier and be like, oh hey, all the prices are the same, which relates back to your devil's advocate point, which makes me want to punch you in the face, which is that having options is not the same as competition when the service and the pricing is exactly the same or so similar that you're literally choosing between colors. And I get our networks compared to the US are amazing, great. Whether that's money that the carriers are investing in having strong networks or just the fact is, as you said, we're a much smaller population that's much more urbanly dense than the United States. So it's easier to have cleaner, stronger networks with just less interference and congestion. That still doesn't mean that the carriers can just sit there and look to charge. Like we were going over the plans today, compared, from 2009 to 2014 with the new sharing plans, you're paying more money for exactly the same thing with the assumption that you're going to share data between family members to offset the costs.
Correct.
And,
it's a presumptive business model, but one that has found success in the US. So that's the reason that they're emulating it. But that presumptive business model does have basis in fact, because they found that most families share their wireless service. So it does make sense. Like me and you, like neither of us are like, we don't have families, we don't have kids, but eventually when that happens, that will be a competitive, not a competitive, but a more, I don't know, it would be an easier way to delineate between different service options by saying, okay, I'm going to spend $50 a month per phone number, and then I spend $100 on 15 gigs of data, and then I split it between those four numbers. That actually makes a lot of sense. But the problem is it only gets cheaper than it used to be when you have 3 or 4 numbers on that account. That's the main issue, is that for individuals or for 1 or 2 people, it's inevitably going to be so expensive compared to what it was beforehand.
Which is fine. And if a carrier wants to offer that, I get that. I see the benefit. But having 3 carriers offer essentially similar to the same plans, you can't say that that's competition. It's a difference only in color. And I think the bigger thing with this is even if a fourth national carrier came through and offered similar pricing, like essentially the same thing, if they attempted to treat customers with a modicum of respect or change the approach, like having a carrier, I think part of the uncarrier movement in the U.S., the idea that where's Canada's T-Mobile, isn't just necessarily in the pricing and the options. It's in the idea that they were actually trying to treat their customers, like people that they had to win and earn their business. And part of that might be lip service, it might be a lot of CEO personality, but that stuff bleeds through. And you don't see in our 3 major carriers anything but general contempt for the people that are paying $100 a month for basic service. So there are multiple levels to see this
look,
There are multiple benefits to competition, and it's not just on pricing.
no, obviously I understand that, but I mean, you have to look at it from. Okay, let's use TELUS as an example. TELUS reported churn numbers at 0.9%, which is the lowest they've been in 8 years.
Yeah.
If you say that they're not treating customers with respect, that means that the customers would be leaving, but they're not. They're actually staying, and they're staying longer, and they're buying more phones, and they're spending more money. Their ARPU was up $1.30 over the same period a year ago.
No, yeah, TELUS is the outlier. Like, I think TELUS's customer service is great.
But that's the thing, is that they are differentiating in some way. I mean, I look at it like, I was trying to think of a good analogy, and I guess I came across gas prices, right? You don't give a damn where you fill up unless you have an incentive to fill up at a certain type of station. Like, you know, if you have an Aeroplan card that works only at Esso, or if you have a Petro-Canada account that you want to build up loyalty points for or whatever. But
Daniel,
by and large,
gas contracts. I don't sign a 2-year contract to only buy gas at Esso. Like, you don't.
Okay, but the thing is, you're separating the contract price from you're separating the device price from the plan price, right? You have to do that, because otherwise it doesn't sound. It's not a good. It's not a fair analogy.
No. So let's follow this through, because I think it's instructive to see the difference. Because if the next day, if one day gas is at a certain price, and the next day I go to the gas station that I normally use, where I like the dude, I can get my Timmy's coffee, buy one for Ian, head on my way. And the next day they raise the price. I can make a decision then and there to basically say, whoa, they upped the gas price by 25 cents a liter, whatever. I'm gonna check out the place down the road to see if that's different. That's too rich for my blood. They don't say, hey, you know that gas that you've been paying for 6 months, or that you bought last month, that you're locked in to pay? We're gonna now up the amount that you're paying for that for the next year, and there's nothing you can do about it because you signed a contract with us.
But that's exactly what they do with energy. Or a mortgage. I mean, it's the same thing. If you sign a 30-year mortgage on a variable rate, you initially get a lower price with the assumption that it will either rise or fall depending on market conditions. Now, we're talking about it because we believe that market conditions should push down data prices. If it makes sense that the CapEx expenditures, that the CapEx that these companies are putting towards building networks follows through, at some point there will be enough bandwidth and enough spectrum and enough towers and enough everything to eventually push down prices. That hasn't happened. In fact, the opposite has happened. We were able to buy 6 gigs of data 4 or 5 years ago for less than we are today. But that doesn't mean that the actual quality of the service has gone down. So, you're looking at it like, if you pay for gas and you're buying Sunoco, they advertise way better gas, and you pay an extra cent or two for that, and it'll keep your car around longer. Then that's something that you work into the value proposition of going to Sunoco, right? I mean, Bulldog Power, it's cleaner energy. You pay more for that. It's like any product. You pay a premium for better service.
I don't know if we're paying a premium for better service, though.
But you are. I mean, let's look at Rogers, okay? Let's look at the fact that Rogers owns more spectrum than Bell or TELUS. So theoretically, again, devil's advocate here, they have a 2600 megahertz network that in certain parts of the country can reach speeds of over 100 megabits per second. Rogers is not charging customers more than Bell or TELUS for the same amount of data, but you're actually getting faster speeds with Rogers than you are with Bell or TELUS. In British Columbia, you may get way better service with TELUS because they have more towers. TELUS is not charging customers in British Columbia more than Rogers or Bell. So you have to figure that there are advantages to certain carriers depending on where you are in the country or which phone you have, because Rogers has 2600 support and only some phones that have 2600 support, and Rogers goes out of their way to push them. So you know what I'm saying? Like there are advantages to being with one carrier over another. With Wind, you're paying half the price, but you're getting 1/4 of the service.
No, and I understand that, and I guess what I would prefer to see is carriers make those choices as truly part of their value proposition, rather than in Wind's case being logistically constrained from providing what they would like to, right? It's not a matter of hey, we're looking to undercut on pricing and service. It's like, we actually want to provide better service, we just can't right now. Second, I think that if, telecom is the industry that we cover, and it's why we have a passion and a focus for it. And I definitely don't want to come across as, I understand the requirements of businesses and in terms of making money, and the limits of competition in a capitalist environment. But I do think that if there's a reason why we have nationalized healthcare, and if you were, if your comparison
God,
is
you just went to the
insurance, no, because if your points of comparison are housing mortgages and insurance companies, and part of our telecom model is based upon following what the U.S. has done, and you see what is going on with the housing crisis in the U.S., as well as the problems that they had because they were unwilling to adopt a single-payer health insurance option.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want the telecom industry to be like those industries.
I don't want your life.
Yes, essentially. Okay. I think we squeeze this through as much as we can until, maybe until September until this happens. But
okay, no. Let me just round it back to regulation, because you actually make a good point. Okay, the banking system in Canada was by and large saved by tougher regulations on banks during the recession and during the mortgage crisis. Not that didn't stop some of the banks like TD and RBC and CIBC from dabbling in those areas, and certainly they lost a lot of money as a result. But they did it outside of the country. Mm-hmm. Rogers, TELUS, and Bell are working within the confines of current regulation. They're just taking advantage until last week. Rogers was just taking advantage of the fact that they could negotiate exclusivity deals with the new entrants. They were allowed to, and the contracts, we don't know how long they lasted, but we presume they were 5-year contracts, and now those contracts are ending, and these companies are complaining to the CRTC that the exclusivity agreements are still allowed. So what did they do? They took those exclusivity agreements away. They took that option off the table. That is a piecemeal solution to what the government feels. I know the government wants to regulate roaming in Canada. They have to, but they just have to figure out a way of doing it without harming the regional carriers that rely on the opposite of, they rely on those shared agreements with the bigger companies like Rogers to offer national service. So MTS basically is saying, hey, listen, we know that we have really good service in Manitoba, and we'll give it to you, but then you have to give us really good service in every other part of the country. If you want to claim that you cover 98% of Canadians with HSPA Plus and LTE, then you have to provide us your HSPA Plus network at a really good price in other parts of the country. So Rogers is saying that these unilateral domestic roaming agreements that they have with companies like Wind are completely different than the bilateral agreements that they have with MTS, because they don't get anything out of these unilateral agreements. So I understand that from a business perspective.
I get that. So,
Wind is basically a leech.
Yeah, but okay. So they are taking advantage of ingrained logistics to the way the Canadian telecom industry is set up. I totally get that. I guess what I'm looking for is, earlier this week I wrote about ethical app usage, and
yes, you did.
Where the user is required to, like, what relationship a user has to both the applications that they use or the hardware that they use, if we want to talk, the hardware parts of the phones that we use and where they're sourced from, and the companies behind them. One of the companies that I brought up was Chipotle, who has pursued ethical food sourcing and seen not only their sales go up, but more customers go to it. I'm not saying that every company is going to pursue that approach. I just want to be a customer in a system where there's an opportunity for one of those companies to make that choice, to not always just take advantage of the rules as they're laid out and provide a different option. I just want that company to be able to exist in that environment, because if one company exists, there's an option for me, there's an option for others, and it actually might force some change. But if it is just a hegemony of 3 customers or 3 carriers taking advantage of the rules as they're laid out, based upon, you know, ingrained historical opportunities, splitting, you know, their subscriber numbers almost dead even within 1 million or 1.5 million, you know, trading 30,000 customers back and forth every quarter. That's not. There's more. There's a better option there, and I think we should push for that. I think as consumers we'd want it, we'd benefit from it, and it's the job of maybe the government to do as much as possible to allow for that environment to exist.
Yeah, I agree, but I also think you're being a bit naive, because these are businesses and their responsibility is to their shareholders.
It's amazing how much money you can make when customers really want to give it to you.
Yeah, I totally understand that. You know, Rogers 3.0 is basically all about that. I mean, they haven't really done anything with it yet, but Guy Lawrence's idea is to make it a more customer-friendly company that's more integrated, so you spend less time on the phone talking to 5 different CSRs, because they're training one CSR to do 5 different jobs. I guess that's a good thing, you know, ultimately. Mm-hmm. You and I have a very different relationship with these companies than most Canadians. Most Canadians hate these companies, but they're forced to deal with them. Yeah. I see both sides. I see the people working behind the scenes who do really good work and just try to earn a good living, and like, they don't try to piss anybody off. They're not going out of their way to screw customers.
No, I get that.
They really just want to do a good job and get home. And then when I talk to Rogers executives, all they want to do is be, you know, responsible to their shareholders and you know, issue a substantial dividend.
Yeah, and shareholder responsibility is like a legal responsibility. It's not just something that they personally feel that they need to do. They're required by law to do that. I totally understand that, but we see examples in other situations where you can be responsible to your shareholders, where you can go in and put a good day's work. And I'm not attacking the individuals here, and that's why in the beginning I preface this, but I don't want to come off as ranty. The frustration is everyone's self-interested and doing what works for them, and not taking a step further. We'll see if Rogers 3.0 is anything more than lip service. Obviously, what Bell's doing is with an eye towards the upcoming talks. But I am certainly naive. But if you just accept the conditions as they're laid out, then we're just going to be spending our time every week talking about the same circumstances, right? So I understand it's a little naive to expect all of them to take a different approach, but I just want an opportunity for one, and I don't think it's naive to expect that. I think it's capitalism demands it.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so we're about at an hour. We have a choice. We can continue talking about other things, or we can fulfill our promise and just end up, in a good place with this time. So, what do you want to do?
The only thing that I even wanted to ask you about, there's other things that we could talk about. But I just wanted, you've been playing with some cool hardware recently, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. You've been doing some reviews. You've been playing with the OnePlus One, but maybe we can save that for next week, because this was just straight Canadian carrier talk at the most detailed level. So let's just drop the mic and get out, see how people respond, and next week can maybe be about fun hardware stuff.
Yeah. All right. So let me just give you a preview. So I've been playing with the OnePlus One. I got the 64 gig version. It's It's actually pretty nice. It's a 5.5-inch device. It runs CyanogenMod. It's pretty slick. It's a really nice device, and I'm happy with it. What I will say though is that it's pretty expensive to import into Canada. So if you're looking to do that, I would suggest you wait until they get a better distribution partner, because DHL charges you like $80 in duty. But it's a pretty competitive product, even at the price. I paid $350 for this plus shipping plus duty, so it comes to about $460. And I think it's very good. It's a better product than the Nexus 5. It's got a way better camera, better battery. I've also been playing with the G3, and I reviewed it, and I got a lot of flack for giving it a lower than average, for a flagship, a lower than average score of 8.3. I really do think it deserves an 8.3. I think that it has a lot of issues, that some of which can be corrected in software, but you can't review a product for what could be fixed later on in software. So I had to review the device I had today, and the device I had today deserves an 8.3, which I have to state is a pretty good score. I mean, it's an A minus. Like, who wouldn't be happy with an A frickin' minus?
I always was. But yeah, and I think we talked about this before when you first got it. LG was saying, "Isn't final software? Isn't final software? Isn't final software?"
But I did get a final hardware version.
Yeah, but you review as is, and if it's a situation where they fix those things, then we'll readdress it. But as it stands right now, going out and purchasing one, you're looking at an 8.3, kids. Quit hating.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great product. So all right, well, we're gonna leave it there for this week. I think this has been a really great podcast. We will probably open it up to the public next week. I think that's going to be our next big thing, is people have been asking us to do a live hangout, and they can ask questions using the Q&A functionality. So if you do want that, just let us know in the comments. But I think it'll be fun. So yeah, let's do it. Doug,
it'll be more fun to talk about hardware and different apps and things like that than when there's just more questions. And also, we're opening ourselves up to serious criticism the week after we talk about like detailed cell tower technology, because I'm sure you got like one thing wrong that like 50 people across Canada are just killing themselves about.
Oh, totally. 100%.
And we'll make sure to tell you next week.
Okay. Well, if you do want to correct me, go for it. All right. Well, that's SyrupCast for this week. Thanks again, and we will talk to you next week.
Shout out Manitoba.
MTS, baby.